So I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Adrian Bravo. He's an associate professor with tenure in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the College of William and Mary. That's in Williamsburg, Virginia. He did his undergrad in psychology at William and Mary. He's also a history major, so you can ask him lots of fun questions about history. Is that U.S. history?
Latino US.
Okay. He has an MS in experimental psych and a PhD in applied experimental psychology from Old Dominion University, which is also in Virginia. He did his postdoctoral fellowship at the Center on Alcohol, Substance Use, and Addictions at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Bravo has wide research interests, primarily focused on substance use and mental health among diverse populations. His work helps to identify individuals most susceptible to the development of substance use and mental health disorders and what factors may moderate the relations between health risk factors and health outcomes. He's involved in multiple cross-cultural and cross-university collaborations. He's the founder and principal investigator of the Cross-Cultural Addiction Study Team, which is a collective of 18 international scientists across 7 countries. He's also the founder and principal investigator of the Hispanic Addiction Research Team, which is a collective of 12 researchers across 8 universities. He's received multiple grants from agencies such as NIH, Spanish Ministry of Science, and the Argentine National Secretary of Science and Technology. He's won multiple teaching and mentorship awards, most recently the William and Mary Alumni Fellowship Award for Teaching Excellence in May of this year. He's also the co-founder and the current president of the Research Society on Marijuana, and he serves as the associate editor of their journal, Cannabis. He's also the associate editor of 2 other journals, Mindfulness and the Journal of Psychology and AI. He's a highly published and sought after colleague. He has over 140 publications and is published with over 200 co-authors.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet. Which shows his high degree of collaboration. Lots of people like to work with Dr. Bravo. We're really excited to have him here today, and let's welcome him.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Adam, for the gracious invitation to come here and speak to you all today. Really appreciate it. Very excited to be here. So here, focusing today, I'm going to talk about the cross-national work and the work we've done in really looking at harm reduction, but particularly in the lens of protective behavioral strategies among youth, young adults, predominantly in college. For this, feel free to ask questions. I'm so used to teaching, so raise your hand, interrupt me. I'm very easygoing, especially if something's unclear as we progress.
Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry,
No problem.
you're good.
So first, just want to acknowledge my funding sources. So first, at William Mary, I have a summer research award that helps fund the Hispanic Addictions Research Team, our first project, which I'll discuss later today. I'm also recently awarded the Margaret S. Glauber Fellowship, which is help funding the cross-national work that we are doing within the Cross-Cultural Addiction Study Team. Next, the work that's funding this work in Argentina and Spain. Here, working with my colleagues Angelina Pilati and Ricardo Badossi. Here, they have a longitudinal study looking at protective behavioral strategies within Argentinian, particularly freshman students. Next, I am also a co-director on a postdoctoral fellowship for a student in Argentina. There, we're creating a new protective behavioral strategies intervention, but focusing on counterfactual thinking and trying to improve individuals' utilization of these strategies. And finally, I'm on a funded grant in Spain looking at the longitudinal impact of cannabis and particularly harm reduction within cannabis use among community young adults in Spain. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today. So today in the talk, first I want to talk and bring everyone to the attention of how we define harm reduction, the work that we do, and particularly in protective behavioral strategies and defining the different concepts before diving into the work that we've done over the years. First, I'm going to talk about alcohol and marijuana PBS, the work that we've done, particularly in the US, and what has led to the current research that we're doing internationally within this realm. Then we'll focus on cross-national funding. Is harm reduction similar in other countries? Do people look at it the same way? Do they have similar perceptions and so forth? And then finally, talking about the current projects that we're doing and future directions that we're doing in this area of work. So how to begin to talk? Well, there's a photo of me, which might be really odd for people who are used to these kind of research talks, but I think it's important to highlight why I care about this work and what's really true to me. So there's a photo of me. Sorry, Yankees, they lost. It's okay, I won't blame y'all. And then this photo is my best friend Wilson. So I'll share a story. About 13 years ago, I was on a senior in college, winter break. Wilson's at my house. We party together all the time. We go out to different parties. I spent the night. That night, he's like, "Hey, you're gonna party? We're gonna party in Virginia Beach." I'm like, "No, I'm partying out in Newport News. I'll just meet you up the next day." Next day rolls around. My girlfriend, now wife, texts me like, "Hey, his mom posted something weird on Facebook or something. You might want to check in." I call his mom up, she's at the hospital. Wilson drank and drove and hit a tree and was in a coma. So I immediately went to the hospital, was there, really was in a coma. His mom obviously been there for 24 hours. I said, go home, you relax, I'll let you know if anything changes. In the meantime, she was gone. The doctors came in, showed us the CT scan and everything. At best, he'd be a vegetable. So being young and 21 at the time, he asked, like, do you want to tell her or us? And I was like, well, it'd be better for us. And so me and her, his stepdad and another friend broke the news to her that at best he'd be a vegetable. The next day, she had to make a decision if she's gonna pull him off life support or not. She made a decision to do so, and I signed as a witness, my best friend passing away. That day, she said, call up your friends, they gotta say goodbye. And so on Thursday, I had to call up our friends, cold call them and tell them he's not gonna live. So they came. Friday, they said, oh, you're more than welcome to stay in a room. And so we're like, oh, okay. So I held his hand until he passed away. It really was just turned cold, and that's what happened. So that work, it'll be 13 years in December, really guides this area. Yes, drugs can be fun, drinking, using marijuana, but there are risks associated with it, particularly as young adults really don't view that could happen to you, and that the disability kind of aspects until it does, unfortunately. And so for me, this is what drives my research. For all of you, you have your own reasons for doing it. And I just want to thank you all because the work you all are doing really is impacting communities, either on the prevention side, intervention, basic science, and so forth. And that's what really draws me to this work. Now, I know that's a super depressing way to start a talk, but here's a photo of my 3 kids that are on Halloween. Maxwell here is a dolphin. My middle child, Jocelyn, here is a mermaid. And then my oldest is, if you're a big Minecraft friend, the Ender Dragon that she created herself. So hopefully more uplifting. So what do we mean by harm reduction? So here I'm going to talk about how I conceptualize harm reduction and really talk about the things I don't actually do. So here, the best way I think about it is really looking at the minimization of psychological, medical, and social harm associated with drug use behavior. Here, the key word being minimization, not abstinence approach or just taking everyone away from being able to engage in these things. How do we reduce costs, not just for the individual, but society, environment, neighborhood, DUIs affect others, not just the individual. So harm reduction from my viewpoint really strives to minimize those costs. That being said, what I will focus on today is more on alcohol and marijuana protective behavioral strategies. There's other great harm reduction work being done in opioid work and so forth. But today I'm going to focus more on alcohol and cannabis among young adults. So first, how do we define the construct? Here, the best way that people have conceptualized what protective behavioral strategies are really behaviors used immediately before engaging in that drug use. So kind of determining when you're going to stop, leave the party and so forth. During, not trying to mix too many drugs. We'll see that's not actually happening among young adults. They actually mix a lot of drugs together, but other things like not ripping shots left and right, beer bonging and things like that. And then after, do you have a designated driver? Or do you know where your friends are and things like that become really important. And all of that is used to either reduce the drug consumption itself, the intoxication, or the related harms that come out of it if individuals want to engage in these strategies. So here I'm going to first talk about the alcohol protective behavior strategies literature, because really that's where it kicked off, at least from an empirical standpoint within college student and young adult populations. And then I'll switch over to cannabis and see what particularly Eric's work has really uplifted that kind of work. So here, again, behaviors that an individual can engage in to promote their safety while engaging in alcohol use. So this literature really began with Matt Martin's first developing a measure that assesses protective behavioral strategies. Now, there are lots of litany of work before this that actually were conceptualizing what these harm reduction strategies may be, but the literature hadn't formulated within a particular term. There's a bunch of different measures that had different strategies, but was there a consistent kind of terminology that we can use in comparative studies? So in that work, they developed the first alcohol protective behavior strategy survey, and then that was really focused on college students and really focused on understanding their behaviors with regards to safe drinking. So within their conceptualization and in their measure, they really talk about 3 subtypes of protective behavioral strategies. The first I'll talk about is this idea of manner of drinking. So you can think of things like avoiding drinking games or avoiding trying to outpace others and so forth. And so in the work today, we'll talk about each of these factors and really which ones are most salient in predicting harm and reduction in harm if people actually engage in these strategies. But manner of drinking, particularly during the episode, becomes really important. Additionally, limiting and stopping drinking, this idea that you have to be planning ahead of how you're going to engage with that behavior that day. So here, determining not to exceed a certain number of drinks, but leaving the bar or party at a predetermined time are good examples of this approach to reducing either the intoxication or particularly serious harms that might be associated if you go too far. And then finally, the serious harm reduction aspect of it, particularly here using a designated driver, knowing where your drink has been at all times, or knowing that you're leaving with a friend or someone that actually will support you, even if you're in a truly intoxicated blackout stage, for example. So within their conceptualization and the way the measure was assessed, you can either look at a total score, looking at the sum of all the different strategies that people engage in, or you can look at it differently based on the subtype of strategies that they're engaging with. And so in our work, we've done a little bit of both. So what drew me to this field? Around 2013, when I was entering grad school, my PhD advisor had a former PhD student called Matthew Pearson who went off to postdoc at the same place I did postdoc at. And Mateo at the time, along with Mark Prince, who also had a review on PBS literature at the time, really tried to synthesize what we know about it. What is it from a model standpoint, really letting us know who is engaging in these strategies, and more importantly, doesn't it actually reduce use, consequences, and so forth. So within that paper, he drew this conceptual model of how we understand protective behavioral strategies. Here, focusing first where PBS is, really conceptually thinking about it as a really proximal variable to use and consequences naturally as you're engaging in it while you're engaging with the alcohol use. Here, PBS can have direct relationships with alcohol use, so lowering quantity, intoxication, and so forth, but it can also directly just relate to reducing harm associated with someone's drinking. Additionally, theoretically, it could also moderate the link between alcohol use and problems. We'll talk about that and how that's not true, at least in our replication work. But additionally, there's antecedents that predict protective behavioral strategies, so individual differences on things like substance use motives, or personality variables like impulsivity, age of first use. Women tend to use PBS more often than men, and so forth. And then there's moderators. It might not be efficacious for everyone. I think one of the things that, and we'll talk about it through the work we've done internationally, context matters when it comes to applying these strategies. And if you don't look at that, then it makes it really hard to just say, oh, it works for everyone. It really doesn't. Those things really matter. So looking at moderators become important as well. So from this conceptual model, it really made me want to focus in on, well, can we better understand these individual differences in order to target individuals who might have deficits or might not be engaging in these strategies in an appropriate way? And so this is where I'll draw the first part of this line of work, is really understanding, does PBS really mediate the relationship between more of these distal kind of variables, whether personality variables or motivations, onto substance use, in this case, alcohol, and consequences and use. So this leads to the first paper I ever did as a first author, working with Mark and Mateo on this project. And the first was like, all right, let's just replicate it. You know, a lot of the times in college student research, it was for a long time these single studies that were done at one university, and every time there was a limitation of, oh, we can't replicate, it was a low sample size, am I not generalizing, and so forth. And so the first thing is there's been a lot of one-off studies showing that these distal antecedents might relate to PBS use, and then in turn might relate to less or more harm depending on the risk or protective factor. So in our first paper, we want to just test this, let's really see what is most salient in predicting utilization of PBS, and is it really protecting? So in this work, don't worry about all the text, we ended up doing 5 replications of prior studies that were single studies that really looked at different predictors, whether it's age of first use, self-regulation, impulsivity-like traits, depressive symptoms, and conscientiousness. In your original articles, they argue that in age of first use, the longer you wait, the more likely you are to use PBS. Individuals who have higher self-regulation, lower impulsivity, and were not experiencing depressive symptoms, and were higher in conscientiousness, were the ones that were more likely to use PBS. And so in our replication of each of these, and we did find support for that each of them really did have an association, and differentially looking at who might be engaging in these three strategies versus those who were not. And so that was at first what we thought was like, okay, this paper's gonna get published, we're good. The associate editor at the time, who I think was Mark Schwer at the time, really pushed back and say, okay, you're replicating, but like, you never answered your question. What is most salient? So he actually led us to actually let's do a comprehensive model and see what is most salient in predicting PBS use when accounting for the variance across all these other important predictors that we know have strong ties to problematic substance use and so forth. So in the same paper, we ended up doing a large comprehensive model where we included all the predictors within the same model to account for their prediction on PBS use and consequences. Now, a lot of variables. The first thing I want to just highlight is that above and beyond the variance explained by all these other predictors that we know are really big risk factors for substance use and problematic substance use, PBS use still accounted for some variance in predicting use and consequences. Now, the thing that for me is most important, it had a stronger effect on consequences than use, which is kind of hard to do when part of it is literally limiting how much you're drinking. Why would it have a stronger effect on consequences and so forth? And we'll talk a little bit more into cross-national findings of why that might be. But looking at all the predictors, by far the only two that really were salient in accounting for PBS use above and beyond is first, age of first use. The longer you wait, the better you are at implementing these strategies and so forth. Now, it could be that, yes, you have more brain development and you're able to make decisions in a more informed way, but it may be just from pure experience that there are other responsibilities and you don't want to engage in such heavy intoxication, blackout drinking and so forth. Thus, let me use safe strategies to reduce that risk. The other one, by far, was self-regulation. So individuals who are really good at being able to check in and understand what behaviors are actually good in the context that they are and so forth, are more likely to just engage in PBS use overall. So this first paper really draws in from Mateo's model of those more distal predictors. The other one that we were interested in was motives, particularly because motives really drive why people might engage in a substance. The problem is, if you're motivated to use, that's really counterintuitive to using safely. If your goal is to get really intoxicated, PBS ain't for you, because the goal is not for you to get that intoxicated and so forth. So in the prior literature and the reviews that Mark and Mateo did, they did find that substance use motives were strongly linked to less PBS use. And so our question was, is that replicating once more? And so here, once again, we collaborated across universities to look at, do the alcohol motives, particularly looking at social motives, enhancement motives, conformity motives, and coping motives, relate to problematic alcohol use via lower engagement of protective behavioral strategies. And overall, that is what we consistently found, particularly less so for conformity. But if you're drinking a Coke, if you're doing it for social reasons, and if you're doing it to just enhance your experience, you're just less likely to use it because it is counterintuitive to at least what your perception is going in to that drinking event. And so it's interesting looking at that.
What motivations were, sorry if I missed this, were associated with greater propensity to engage in these?
Yeah, so all these, none. So if you're here, to be fair, the motivation is being drinking. So if there's other motivations for you engaging in that social context, that may become more protective and so forth. We'll actually see it play out more because we also looked at, in a couple of slides, looking at how it predicts risky sexual behavior beyond just do motives impact risk for those. And what was interesting is they directly impacted it, but PBS did as well. But yeah, if the focus is on motives just to drink, most of them were very
If you're
risky.
motivated to drink, but if you have any motivations, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, I didn't think about how that would then.
Yeah, and I'm gonna show some work qualitatively where we asked these students, why aren't you doing this? And what are those? And one of those barriers is exactly what you're saying, that motivation piece aspect. Really good point. So in here, we did replicate that work, but this leads into, well, where does it extend mostly to other behaviors beyond just drinking outcomes and other harms associated with problematic drinking? Now, the research with alcohol and risky sexual behaviors is kind of mixed. It really depends on who you're talking about. If it's first-year college students, there's a stronger link. If it's people who are first engaging in their first risky sexual behavior, there's a stronger link between alcohol use and those harms. But working with my colleague, Allison Luby, and others, and for this team, this is one of the first teams I'll talk about that we created. So at this time, Mateo and I were like, all right, let's create a team. I'm tired of these single, our university, your university. Let's bring a group of researchers who are doing PBS work across the United States, and let's pull our resources to get large samples to really test these associations. And so, as you'll quickly realize, I'm not creative. We thought we were so clever. Protective strategy study team, that sounds so good. After an hour, it got really annoying causing it. So I'll never call another team that term, but it really brought researchers who were looking at harm reduction in numerous different fields. So Allison was more interested in risky sexual behavior and this point. So within the model, we wanted to look at how each of these drinking motives, particularly again, social enhancement. Now this time we broke up drinking to cope across anxiety and depression, and then looked at conformity motives as well. Here, I'm actually going to first show you the risk with some of these motives, particularly with conformity with regards to risky sexual behaviors. These things usually happen within a social context. And if you're okay with conformity, then, or endorsing conformity, then you might be at higher risk. Similarly, for different aspects of different motives. But as you can see here, largely these motives, as illuminated earlier, they're really risky. They are all negatively correlated with PBS use, which in turn is putting them at higher risk for more alcohol consumption, but eventually down to more risky sexual behavior. Yet, the one that is supposed to reduce harm, not just drinking harm, does directly link to less risky sexual behavior being experienced, particularly because the specific strategies, and that's something I'll talk about in the cross-national work, is more important. Knowing where your drink has been and going home with a friend is a really strong protective way of not unfortunately dealing with risky sexual behaviors or being placed in a context where that might even be a possibility. And so that kind of extended the work that we did from just alcohol to focusing on other outcomes. But at that time, all of these things were replicating. And so at this point, I was like, well, what's new? What's another individual difference factor that's really unique to college students? And so this is the work where college-related alcohol beliefs started about. Tim Osberg created a measure that was really salient in America. You've seen Old School, you've seen all these movies that talk about drinking, college experience, that's what it's supposed to be like. And so do you have perceptions of what the experience is in America with drinking. And so he created a measure that we called college alcohol-related beliefs, where you believe that part of the college experience is to consume alcohol. What we found in our work is that individuals who endorsed this belief at a stronger rate than others were very much less likely to use any of these protective strategies as well, because it is counter to the idea, I'm supposed to have a good time. Drinking is supposed to be part of that experience. Now you're telling me to reduce my drinking in some capacity. I don't want that. And unfortunately, that leads to more alcohol consumption and more risk for consequences. Again, we're seeing direct relationship between serious harm reduction and consequences, but manner of drinking as well. But less salient with limiting stopping drinking, but beyond PBS use, it seems like these beliefs still hold a salient aspect on their drinking, because above and beyond the variants explained by PBS, there is still a strong link between these beliefs. I'll show the work we've done internationally and show that this still is a phenomenon, even in countries where the education system is quite distinct than what we have here in the US. So here, earlier work was really focused on looking at PBS as a mediator, linking these distal factors that we've known in the literature to be risky in promoting problematic drinking. The next question for us is, well, when does it work and when does it not work? If in all the research we've done, PBS is consistently protected, always strongly associated with reducing harm, but is that true of all time in context and groups? Does it work better for some groups of individuals versus others? And so that was our next line of research that we wanted to explore. So here, the first one was really testing this right here. Does PBS truly buffer the relationship between use and consequences? Theoretically, yes, it should somehow. Well, working with Kevin on this project, the short answer is no. So we grouped a lot of projects we worked on previously that assess PBS among young adult college students, and we said, let's replicate as much as we can across these interactions on the litany of alcohol outcomes, whether it's quantity, frequency, consequences, alcohol use disorder symptoms, and so forth. Here, all of them really realized that of all the analyses, 3 interacted in the way we expected, that PBS buffered the relationship between use and consequences. 6 went in the opposite direction. Higher PBS use actually strengthened the relationship between use and consequences. And then 39 more were not statistically significant. So something's going on with these students who are engaging in PBS, but it's still not reducing that link between use and consequences. And doing that work and all the work we've done, particularly in other countries, context matters is what we're realizing more than anything. Just on the like, oh yeah, these strategies will be good, it'll reduce these things. Well, what strategy you're using, can you use it, does implementation be feasible in those settings, really does play a big role in whether it can actually reduce that harm or not. But did it do it with other more distal predictors? And so here, beyond just moving into how does PBS moderate those relationships, well, what factors, particularly personality factors, might moderate the link between PBS use and lower consumption or more lower related harm? And here we looked at mainly impulsivity variables to really look at whether the relationship is strengthened or weakened. And what we really did find is that individuals who are more impulsive really weakens the efficacy of using these strategies and so forth. One reason, and I'll illuminate this more in our cross-national work, if you're impulsive and drinking is a social thing, you're just willing to go with the flow. Hey, you want some shot? Yeah, I'm good. Even if you intended to go do PBS, and that's a measurement problem. And Mark's illuminated this in this work as well. We ask them, hey, how often do you do this? Or on average, how do you do this? But if you ask them that day, did you use it? They're like, no. Even if they say they always use it. And so we had an EMA study where we looked at rates of cross-sectionally in the last 3 months, how often you're using it versus daily. And we like, all right, you say use every time. Except your daily data tells us you're not using it every time. So what is going on within this as well? But there are individual differences within this work as well. Additionally, working with colleagues we're particularly interested in post-traumatic stress disorder. I do a lot more research with PTSD and moral injury and veterans work, but we wanted to look at it within college students as well. Could it also weaken that relationship between PBS, particularly PTSD and PBS behaviors? Here, what was interesting is we actually found a three-way interaction where it really did differ between men and women. So in the literature, men don't use PBS as often as women. But what was really interesting for us was looking at how PTSD relates to these consequences and use. PTSD was a risk factor. The question is, would individuals who normally engage in these strategies weaken that link? What we found was actually it was only for women where it was most protective, particularly looking at how does limiting stopping drinking moderate the relationship. Here for men, you see that regardless of average or below the mean or above the mean on PBS, pretty much it's a positive relationship. Similarly for serious harm reduction, but you see the interaction starting to play out more for women, even with serious harm reduction, where it might not interact only at this, but if you extend the range out, you'll see the interaction playing out. And so it seems like for some groups of individuals, it's really helpful, but it depends on who they are, the context, and so forth. And so for most of this research so far, we've really been limited to looking at it cross-sectionally and understanding it in that way. But at first, it was the foundation work that I needed to better understand who do we need to work on. We believe it works, but who actually utilizing it? Why aren't they utilizing it? And what are the next steps in improving the efficacy of these aspects? So this is where we get to the clinical issue. Clinically, everyone uses PBS. All the most evidence-based college student drinking research incorporates it in some way, whether it's the main component or part of the component. And many systematic reviews have shown it's really promising to doing it. So it's used in personalized normative feedback, using brief motivational interviewing, within treating college students who might have an alcohol mandate or some issues with their drinking. The problem is, their students don't use it. So what is going on? And so that led to one of our first qualitative work and really better understanding what is going on. What are your perceptions of it? The issue is, as in most academia, the scientists are making up these things. They're like, yeah, everyone's doing this. I'm like, have you talked to the people who actually are the lived experiences of those individuals? And so what we did a really simple design for this study. Pros and cons of using PBS. We have college student drinkers. Name 5 pros of using it, 5 cons of using it. And then we did the analysis to look at what popped out. What was really interesting is that they do believe it's good. They do believe it reduces harm. And so it's not an issue convincing them like, hey, that will limit your intoxication and will limit the harm associated with it. The problem is this part. Why aren't you using it? So the first thing that I wasn't surprised about was 100% goal conflict. Again, if your goals get fucked up and blackout, that's what's gonna happen. And so you're not gonna wanna use these strategies to deal with that aspect of it. Additionally, what was new for us was this idea of social. I guess it's uncool to drink safely. And that was something we never considered in our work, this idea of that social pressure to add people on and do so. And we'll see later work, particularly in other countries, where refusal self-advocacy is actually a more prominent feature than just engaging in PBS because of that reason. But in the US, most drinking happens in social, particularly in college student settings, frats, or these house parties and things like that. So once you're in that environment, it's really hard to, especially if you're an impulsive person and so forth, to say no, or to not, or even a number of strategies you were using. Now, the two that really led to the biggest impact on our clinical view of these things was one, it's hard to implement. And I kind of understood it. One of the quotes was, it can be difficult to alternate between a non-alcoholic drink and an alcoholic drink while at a bar. I'm like, oh, I've been there. Long line, $20 bottle of water. I'm not doing that either. And so that is, hey, I'm done drunk. We can't just be saying, use these strategies, use these strategies. They're really safe. And you're like, when am I doing it? And ineffectiveness. Well, why would I need to know how to leave, what time to leave at a party when the party's at my house? That's a really good point. It's really hard for me to just tell you to do all of them because it's beneficial you do more, but it might not match the context that came in. And so this qualitative work helped us in R01 project that I was a project coordinator for, looking at creating an ecological momentary intervention to help individuals keep track and more importantly, implement the strategies. From the qualitative piece, we changed the design. Originally, we were going to say, use this strategy, use this strategy, use this strategy. And the first thing we realized, you need to have them decide what they're going to use and make more efficacy of actually implementing. So here, we really wanted to create an intervention that would increase the effectiveness of these strategies. And thus, the way it worked was first, do you intend to drink? Now, there is a lot of newer research talking about unplanned drinking and how problematic that is, because some of these strategies you do have to plan out. Knowing who's your designated driver, you got a prior plan. Or the most designated drunk driver who drank the least is what happens when it's unplanned. Here, we first asked, where do you intend to drink, yes or no? Once they said yes, then instead of saying, here's a litany of strategies, go use them all, here's strategies, choose your own that you would like to implement that evening when you're consuming alcohol. So things like, do you have a number of drinks goal? Do you want to keep your BAC below 0.08? Over how many hours do you intend to drink? Once they gave us their own motivation, or at least indication that they intentionally want to use these strategies. Our part was the implementation side of it, reminding them. So the way it worked is that as they were engaging in the content, that drinking context, we would just send reminders. Hey, you told us you wanted 2 hours, just letting you know there's an hour left. Don't try to rip shots in the last 30 minutes to make up for that. And so just reminding them how that plays a role. And that might be a more efficacious way of incorporating these strategies as opposed to just saying, do them all, because that might not work from a context standpoint. So now transitioning to marijuana, and while we may view it as a very distinct drug, are the distal predictors the same? Are these individuals also engaging or not engaging in PBS? And is it protective as much as it's been in alcohol? So here, same kind of construct and principle, this idea that it's supposed to reduce harm. Here, Eric was the one who first started establishing it within the marijuana literature about protective behavioral strategies. Now, unlike in alcohol, where there are those 3 different categories, here, it's really a total score, a litany of different strategies you can use here to reduce that. So knowing who you're buying from, a trusted source, not using early in the morning, like waking, baking, things like that, making sure you also have a designated driver and so forth are key aspects of these strategies. So one of the things we first wanted to do was, does it matter? There's a litany of factors that play a role in predicting marijuana use and consequences of it. So in this study, we wanted to investigate, well, what's the most salient predictor that splits up individuals into who's at most risk for developing these issues and so forth. So in this recursive partitioning kind of paper, we threw in hundreds of variables that have been known to be linked to substance use, particularly marijuana use among college students. And what we did was classifying trees to see where people split off based on the most salient predictors. What we found, particularly for negative consequences, individuals split around 8. So 8 was a cutoff in the sense that some people were less risky versus more risky for consequences. For individuals who are at higher risk, regardless of lower risk, frequency matters. The less you use, the less risk of consequences and so forth. Here, for those who are at high risk, urgency and impulsivity play a big role. But here, for the individuals who are theoretically reduced, at least engaging in less problematic use based on the number of consequences they're experiencing, after accounting for frequency, it really split off based on if they're using marijuana protective behavior strategies or not. Now, the mean is 8.1. Here, for individuals who were lower than 8.1, there was a split after frequency where people who are engaging are using 4 or more strategies, their mean consequences was much lower. But here, for people who were using less PBS, their mean was matching the mean up there, indicating that, hey, this is a strong salient predictor. It really does differentiate people who might be at more harm versus less harm, depending on what type of strategies they're using.
So can you clarify what consequences of marijuana that we're looking at here? I feel like with the alcohol, it's more maybe intuitive about how these types of strategies would affect it more acute consequences. So.
No, it's a really good question. So in this, we use what's called a brief marijuana consequences questionnaire, and it's meant for college students. So some of the consequences like missing class, less so here about being hungover, but more being foggy the next morning and so forth. And in fact, and social problems, how much of it impact your relationship. And then there are some impaired control kind of consequences as well. But typically in the literature, we just sum up the number of consequences out of that. But I will talk about this idea, can we match specific strategies to specific consequences? Because it is an important aspect. Next, similar, let's replicate what we see in alcohol PBS. If Eric's introducing it, it's supposed to be a protective factor. Does it also play the same way? Are the same individual difference kind of impulsivity, motives also indicating to us who's more likely to use these strategies or not, and so forth? So the first paper we did was looking at motives and all these other distal predictors. Now, here, the title, when we first submitted this and it got published, the editor was like, are you sure about your title? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, it's gonna be controversial. I'm like, I know, I believe it, so we need this title. And so that really wanted us to look at, does PBS, just like it does for alcohol, mediate the relationship between these distal factors? And once again, A was a robust factor predicting lower use and consequences, even when accounting for all the other predictors. But looking at remediation, it did mediate the effects of women using more PBS. Looking at impulsivity, the more impulsive you are, the less likely you are to use marijuana PBS. And motives. More you're motivated to use marijuana, the less likely you are to use these strategies. So it seems like we're at least conceptually seeing similar kind of results are happening with marijuana PBS. Similarly, we wanted to look at PTSD again and looking at it this time as a mediator and looking at, does that also explain those relationships? And here we see that higher PTSD symptoms was associated with lower protective behavioral strategies for marijuana use, which in turn created risk both for frequency and quantity of use, which downstream more higher reports of cannabis use disorder symptoms and problematic marijuana use. And so here we replicate this model, even we're accounting for issues in marijuana use literature about what's the best way to assess it. Is it quantity, is it frequency, and so forth. But regardless, PBS seems to be protective, and at least for individuals, they might be less likely to engage in it if they're or endorsing higher PTSD symptoms. What about other things that are common in college students? Apparently y'all don't sleep. So one of my researcher colleagues, Maria, who's more of a sleep researcher among young adults, was interested in, these strategies, you have to really think through some of them. Whether you can actually time it out, really think and remind yourself, yeah, I said 2 hours. Yes, I said this number of drinks, but we naturally forget. So we wanted to test this idea of, well, what if you're not at your peak best, and at least from a cognitive standpoint? So we were interested in this insomnia or poor sleep problems, make it more difficult for you to implement these strategies and thus might lead to more problematic use and so forth. And so here we did find support for PBS to mediate the relationship between sleep difficulties on PBS, they're just less likely to use it, which in turn created more risk for problematic marijuana use down the road. Here, looking at, once again, whether it moderates, so moving into the second part of that model, seeing if it replicates what we've seen in alcohol. Here, we actually had more success in showing that PBS actually did buffer the relationship, particularly between impulsivity and marijuana consequences. So once again, really having that framework of that conceptual model implicating this work. The last part, before diving into the cross-national piece, is what about self-efficacy and refusal self-efficacy? If I'm really good at saying no, why do I need to implement these strategies? So here we conceptually drew a model that tried to incorporate refusal self-efficacy along with PBS. Now, here, decision to abstain versus decision to use, by the conceptualization of PBS, and you can't abstain unless you view those as protective behavioral strategies. That's another thing we'll talk about in our cross-national work. But it's really this idea that your implementation of these strategies should reduce harm. But with refusal self-efficacy, you're taught, so it's being taught how to use these strategies effectively. So are you good at saying no, that mastery aspect of it? Vicarious learning. Have you seen others model that behavior? It makes it much more likely that you engage in it as well. And then social persuasion and affective state might play a role in how well you can actually refuse. What we ended up finding in this research was that they are both really great protective factors, but interaction wise, might not be needed. In the sense that individuals, yes, were high in both, reported the lowest consequences in use, but the interactions were largely non-significant. Which kind of makes sense, like why would I need to implement it if I can just say no? And we'll look at how that's actually been showing up in qualitative work across nationally in other countries doing very different perceptions of how to drink safely or use marijuana safely. Additionally, I alluded to earlier this idea of context. Well, do people engage in these strategies depending on an event that may be due? So in this study, we did a daily diary study. The really goal of that study was to look at 420 as a marijuana use holiday. Do students actually engage in more marijuana use and consequences on 420 compared to a weekend and so forth? So we followed them up about 5 days before 420, on 420, and 5 days after. Here, I'm going to show you the work of looking at it with predicting PBS use. What we find is that on 420 compared to weekend or weekend days, they use less PBS, which is problematic, especially for individuals who are not used to using marijuana. First time and really thinking of these event-specific use holidays might be really an important context kind of event where we need to promote more safer use of these kind of behaviors, whether it's with alcohol or marijuana. But in this case, naturally, hey, it's a holiday, I'm gonna enjoy myself, why would I implement these kind of things? And it plays out too with looking at social motives being the strongest predictor of 420 use compared to others. But we have a conundrum. One of the best items in every either alcohol or marijuana, do not mix with other drugs. The problem is, in reality, most young adult college students are mixing. And all the studies we've done in the US and even cross-nationally, finding students who only use marijuana and who do not drink is a rare group of individuals. Usually less than 5% in every sample we've ever had. So the question is simultaneous use the common way? Or is it a concurrent? Yes, I use both drugs over the last 30 days, but I actually don't mix them versus simultaneously mixing them. And in work within the US, a large percentage of individuals who endorse both are simultaneously mixing them during the same time period where the effects coalesce and thus you become more intoxicated. Thus, do these models that we've shown independently actually apply similarly for individuals who have both or engage in both drugs? And so here we tested the same model across both alcohol and marijuana PBS to see what was salient and what was unique to each drug. Here, women for both types of protective behavior strategies were more likely to use these strategies. Age of first use, again, being protective. Interestingly enough, college alcohol beliefs, and now that marijuana is part of a lot of college culture, also were strongly linked to less PBS use. Those were the only things that were consistent across drugs. We did find some differences across different types of impulsivity and social motives, which makes a lot more sense with alcohol. There's rarely weed parties. It's mostly drinking parties on college campuses that just naturally have some people who are smoking marijuana or using marijuana in that context. Here for marijuana, particularly coping motives and this idea of expansion motive, which is unique to marijuana, really become more creative, go with this other mindset while being high, is very unique to marijuana versus alcohol. And that also showed that individuals were less likely to use. But that leads to the global part. I have a lot of colleagues and reviewers. Why are you engaging in cross-national work? And I'm like, the US isn't the only one that has problems in this area. It is a global issue. And our question was, is PBS protective globally across different countries? So here I'm going to present work from the cross-cultural addiction study team. I know Eric introduced the team already, but here you can see the team that is currently constructed. Colleagues here across the US, across 4 states in New York, Colorado, Virginia, and New Mexico, and then colleagues in Spain, Canada, England, South Africa, New Zealand, and Argentina. Most of the colleagues on this actually don't do addiction work, so there's my plug for interdisciplinary work. It's really illuminating because, as we know, there's a million kind of things that might provide risk or protection for drug use, and thus we need to really think about it from a contextual, larger interdisciplinary approach. This is also my quick aside about measurement invariance. Before you start doing this work, please make sure these measures are actually accurately understood and assessed in each of these groups, regardless if it's groups within the US, but particularly across countries. So a lot of our initial work is translating, back translating, and making sure that these constructs that we're assessing are actually well really understood, factor loadings are the same and so forth before we start making these grandiose conclusions that Argentinians aren't using this while Americans are doing so. And so here, just showing some of the work that we've done cross-culturally, looking at alcohol consequences, looking at can we better identify the college student consequences to alcohol use disorder symptoms, and finding where that breakpoint is across countries. Way difficult to do across countries. We ended up suggesting one number, but in each country it's slightly different, so that was important. And then we also did it with marijuana. And this is my claim to fame, getting a college student cross-sectional paper published in Addiction. It's my claim to fame. But here we have to also look at marijuana consequences and make sure that it was invariant. Now, how do we do it with PBS? So me and Mark have had many debates about this idea. Is there a latent factor structure? Now, in the alcohol PBS, they argue that there's 3 categories. I can kind of believe it, but more from a behavioral, not just latent factor, because latent factors argue that if you're truly high in that construct, you should endorse every behavior consistently. But we just found out that context matters. Not every strategy is going to be implemented, regardless if you're theoretically high in PBS. So our first question was, let's get away from just looking at it, a total score or these categories. Where are each of these strategies coming in? And so here, the main point I want to illuminate is that there are more strategies than just the ones we've been using within those measures, even Eric's measures on marijuana. Here, a lot of it was one about behavioral self-control strategy, rewarding yourself for living. That was an interesting one. Do we actually prop ourselves up for actually engaging in safe drinking? Obviously, it's counter to our friends who want us to like take that last shot, but can we reward ourselves and say, hey, I'm getting better at this. I can actually implement it and feel good about it. And so within the countries, we did elastic net regression, and 32 out of all of these, there's about 41 of them, and for 32 of them, they're protected in each country. And in this study, we did in Argentina, Spain, and the US. So these strategies seem to work. And it seems to work in each country uniquely, regardless of all the cultural differences, age, policy, how we view people associate their drinking. And here we see that these strategies do work for each one. But that model that Mateo formulates also replicate in other countries. So in looking at it within Argentinian freshmen, did things that we have seen in prior literature, male sex being a risk factor, age of first drinking, internalized norms. Do Argentinians also believe that drinking is part of the college experience? Their college is free, there's no frats. They've been mostly drinking at an earlier age because 18 is the legal drinking age. Even there, for students that endorse it, that was also a risk factor for lower use of these. Again, we're seeing that impulsivity makes it more difficult for you to implement these strategies. And once again, If you're motivated to have a good time, it's much harder for you to implement these strategies, particularly in this case, manner of drinking, which leads to more protection from use and consequences. And once again, harm reduction directly linking to these consequences. So even in Argentina, it seems like it's playing a consistent role. But what is next? So my colleague Fermin, who's in Spain, really understands this idea that, look, you gotta culturally shift how we talk about these things. It's one thing to tell people, do it, do it, do it, do it. But if they don't believe that others are doing it, particularly their own peers, then it's not gonna be implemented. And so in this study, looking at young adults in, out in Huelva in Spain, we really followed longitudinally individuals' perceptions of descriptive norms. How often are your peers engaging in these strategies? Does that relate to more self-efficacy and perception that these are actually effective? And does that in turn actually improve or at least make you engage in these strategies more? So here, looking across all three different types, whether it's manner of drinking, serious harm reduction, or stop limiting drinking, the more that Spaniard young adult individuals believe that their peers are using these strategies, the more likely longitudinally they find them to be effective, which at the time 3 standpoint, they actually engaged in those strategies more. So somewhere in the designs clinically, social norms matter, especially when you're talking about things that are implemented in certain contexts with certain peer groups, certain friends that might not be generalizable anywhere else in the world. And thus, we are looking now to more current research of how to improve and really highlight this idea that I can't tell these students to drink safely. I'll tell them all day, they eventually have to do it. But as a cultural group, they also have to really want to do it as well. Next, looking at marijuana, similar kind of idea. Let's not just focus on a total score. Let's look at each item and see how it relates to different constructs and so forth. This time, we wanted to look at it across frequency, quantity, and consequences. And in this study, we actually looked at it in 5 countries. And here we added Uruguay. At the time of data collection, it was the only country in the world where recreational marijuana was legal at a federal level. Canada, a couple years later, but at that time, it was the only one. The Netherlands, my colleague in the Netherlands was like, I hope you don't think we use marijuana. I'm like, what? I'm like, what, aren't y'all the ones who have the bake shops? I'm like, no, that's all touristy stuff. Like, we don't really use marijuana. And that's what we found. Of all the 5 countries, marijuana was used less in here. Well, that also ended up showing us differences across country. Yes, PBS is protective against frequency in Argentina, Uruguay, yes in the US, yes in Spain, but not in the Netherlands. In fact, in the Netherlands, there's positive associations between using PBS and these issues. And it's like, what is going on? Why is it not working protectively in this context compared to all these other countries? But additionally, in Argentina, for consequences, it wasn't doing it well. So this has led to newer work, and I'll mention this a little bit, and particularly vaccinating. Are they just using different strategies? Because here, they're forced to answer, do you use these strategies that Americans have made up? So maybe we're just losing that, and that's why it's not as effective, because they really just don't use these or never even heard of them. This plays out in cross-cultural work all the time. When we started looking at using a designated driver, my colleagues in Spain were like, what do you mean by designated driver? I'm like, oh, you have public transportation. That actually works. I forget, and you have walkable cities. And so that idea just doesn't replicate in those kind of countries. So you really have to start diving into more culturally specific context where it might be relevant for these individuals. So, but still, can these kind of models still replicate across countries? So here, one of my grad students was really interested in the big 5 and looking at who's more likely to use PBS. Recall from one of the first replication papers, conscientiousness was one of the predictors of using this. So here, looking at marijuana, once again, conscientiousness does promote more marijuana PBS use. It is also that agreeableness. So back to this idea that maybe we can use this social learning theory and this idea of who's using to really, especially if they're more agreeable, to implement these strategies. And then interesting enough, if you're feeling good, you're less likely to use it. Why? Maybe you can feel like you can manage it and have it under control. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in the work we're doing now. So what are we currently doing now that we've established these associations? We kind of understand that it's not selling them that they work. It's telling them, can they actually use it and do they want to use it? And the norms surrounding it. So here, one of the current international study that we're doing is called Project Class. This will also tell you how uncreative I am, is the cross-cultural longitudinal assessment of stuff study, because there's a lot of predictors in this model, in this data set. So what we did is, we followed up college students across 6 countries for 3 waypoints. So every 3 months we followed them up. And so this data is was collected in Spain, Argentina, the US, Canada, South Africa, and England. And so I just did the data cleaning, you spent time with Mark yesterday, all the thousands of variables, and we ended up with roughly close to 4,500 college students and looking at them over time. And so the real goal is to replicate all the work we've done cross-sectionally, longitudinally, but more importantly, really start identifying within each country what's going on. Additionally, at the time, we were talking about COVID, it was around 2020, 2021, and we're like, is it still gonna be around? We're like, let's just throw in some measures to see what people think about it. And one of the things that we're interested in this idea of COVID stress, even if it's been a couple of years, we forget, in the United States, we were roughly locked down for what, 6 months? In Argentina, it was like a year and a half. That's a very different kind of impact on your mental health and so forth. So in this longitudinal piece, we want to extend what we've done prior work. The other problem. Earlier, I alluded to this idea that students are mixing these drugs, in particular in simultaneous use. Well, the same is true, even internationally. So among young adult college students who are endorsing both alcohol and marijuana in the last 30 days, in each country, roughly 75% of them are simultaneously mixing. Well, it's kind of hard because one of the best PBS items is don't mix with other drugs. More importantly, in looking at it within Spain, and particularly other European places, but in Argentina as well, I also asked about nicotine. And particularly that in those countries, they're used to rolling their cigarettes and things like that. And thus, when we looked at context of when you're using marijuana and alcohol and so forth, are you also simultaneously using with nicotine? For Spaniards and Argentinians, all the time, like 95% of the time they're using marijuana, they're mixing nicotine and then alcohol on top of that because there's a lot of co-use going on. So the question becomes, do we need to become better at focusing on strategies for these type of people? So one of my colleagues, Adrian, her PhD students, creating a measure of PBS for simultaneous users. Because again, the goal is to reduce harm, not which drug you're using. So is there a way to still do that in a way that's safe and doesn't go against their beliefs, more importantly, their want to engaging in these drugs? Are there other strategies that do come out? This leads to really great work that was being done by Bags about. I alluded to earlier, we gave them American versions of these measures and just hope that they implement them or not. Is that true? And so in this study, what we asked is that before endorsing whether they use alcohol or marijuana PBS, we asked them, hey, write in 3 strategies you use before priming them about what strategies exist to really see are there cultural differences in these things. And in looking at the data just yesterday, in Argentina, remember, it wasn't as protected. Well, 3 topics that come out from the Argentinian sample. One is that a lot of them are really good at saying no, apparently. They're like, yeah, my first strategy is just say no. I'm like, that's true. You don't have to implement it then if you really feel that good about it. The other one that was quite interesting is this idea of, I'm good. I can control myself. So this notion that if you really can control it, or at least you believe you can control it, then there shouldn't be any reason for you to extra use these strategies and so forth. And then the second one was more about planning of it, and particularly in how you're going to engage with these strategies, because as we saw, individuals who are lower in premeditation and higher in impulsivity are less likely to implement it. So in Argentina, particularly, they're having to think through more carefully about how to engage, particularly with marijuana, where it's less accessible. It's medicinal allowed, not recreational, but there's delivery systems that come to your place, as I found out last time with Argentina. And so there's a very cultural difference of how they're engaging and what these strategies should be implemented. Finally, highlighting the work that we're doing for intervention aspects of it, as I mentioned before, Gabriela really wants to encourage people to use these strategies within Argentina. The problem is, how do we counter that counterfactual thinking of, it'll be ineffective, my friends will hate me for doing it this way, and so forth. So she's really trying to garner this idea of targeting, using those counterfactual thinking paradigms to be like, no, but that's not true. People are using it. It is effective. Why don't let's really shift your mindset, and thus you might be more likely to engage in these strategies as well. And then finally, my work with Fermin, who we are extending that work that I alluded to earlier about looking at norms, particularly descriptive norms, and looking at perceived efficacy. And this project, something that we're really interested in is the idea of theory of planned behavior and intention. And one thing that I've learned so much from these other colleagues is, you Americans love age of first use. What about age of habitual use? Shouldn't we worry about it when it's a habit? And so in these longitudinal study, we're looking at the model's perceptions and motives and things in the theory of planned behavior. And it's been showing that it does predict PBS and so forth. But once you include habitual use, it actually washes out with other things, because that's the goal. If the true goal is to have people to become their norm, that they implement these strategies, then we have to reach from just use it when you want to it becomes a habit and something second hand to them. And how do we get there? So this longitudinal study, we're better trying to understand it among Spanish youth. The last part, and I'll end on this point, culturally, I'm a Cuban, not immigrant. I also understand that different ethnic groups or different cultural groups might enact and think about these things very differently than others. So just this last year, I created what's called the Hispanic Addictions Research Team. So here, working with colleagues across the US to more focus on mental health and substance use probably within our community, but more importantly, looking at substance use prevention as well. So here, working with colleagues at Harvard, here in Dominguez Hills with Kevin, and others in Central Florida, New Mexico, and Texas, and Virginia, to better understand within Latinos what is going on among these young adult college students, particularly in PBS youth. Because context matters, but once you're in a cultural space and a social norm where you're the outsider, you don't want to stick out. You don't want to be the ones like, oh, why are you not doing this? Even if it might go against your cultural values and so forth. So we're really interested in investigating this. Additionally, looking at more cultural values that might play a role in both their substance use behaviors, but particularly in harm reduction. Here, looking at assimilation and particularly after last night's election, immigration-related stressors like deportation and things like that are going to be important work. And so we're collecting this data now to really look at it within US Latino groups as opposed to my cross-national work, where we're doing this in Argentina and Spain and so others. And thank you, and I'll answer any questions you have.
Few minutes left, but for those of you in the room, I just want to remind you, there is a training session right after this, after you grab some lunch, so if we run out of time and you still want to pick Dr. Broslin's brain, you can come back and chat with him some more, but we can take a couple questions, if anybody has any in the room.
Hello, thank you for the talk, it was really good. My name's Aaron. I was wondering why would tend to use PBS more than men? Is it because they're less impulsive, or what would be the reasons?
So part of it could be just individual differences. My opinion more so is they have to unfortunately think about it more. Unfortunately, there is sexual trauma, sexual assault and things like that. So particularly those serious harm reduction strategies of leaving with a friend, that's probably the number one that gets outweighed more in that regard. And I think just even developmentally how they have to think about, oh, be wary at college drinking and parties and things like that. So it might be at the forefront of their mind more often than men who might not have to be placing those experiences, whether right or wrong. And I think that's where we see it. Now, interestingly, the effectiveness of it works pretty well. It's not a problem, it's a problem is men are just not using it. But once they do use it, it is protective for them, but how do we engage with them in that? And again, I think for a long time, we've just been telling them, use these strategies, use these strategies. We really got to get the qualitative work in and asking them, what do you want to use? What is realistic for you? And that's the way that we actually meet them where they're actually going to do something. Not of course forcing them or telling them that there's only one way to implement this. But I think that's more for the practical reason of doing it. But sure, there might be some other individual different strategies, but I think that's more of a practical reason for them to have to.
Great.
You know.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Adrian. That was awesome. I mean, like every research question, you're like, here's a study on this. And it's really a good example of a coordinated program of research, right? So I just want to ask you in generally about the marijuana protective behavioral strategies, the construct, the measures. Like we got to see some of it. Love to hear you kind of talk a little bit more about what you think are important components of that construct. And then the other thing is, as you know, the products and the culture changes, what do you think we need to add or tweak to that measure? And should Eric do a study on that?
So Eric's been constantly asking someone to trash his measure. And I joked with him yesterday. So, and we're when translating it. So for Main's longitudinal study in Spain, we met me with 3 other Spanish researchers in translating. And it was very helpful to have someone who lives in America, because they're like, the literal translation, like, this makes 0 sense. Like, why would Eric have said it this way? Like, oh, because in America, we understand what that means already. So a good example of this, not even applying to PBS, college alcohol leaves. One of the items when we tried the variance wasn't a variance, and it was like, I consider my college to be academic. And the students in these other countries like, aren't all universities academic? I'm like, oh, you don't know about party school. That's a very American kind of thing. But similarly here with PBS, I think one of the things that we struggle with is that most of the items are really focusing on reducing like the frequency and intoxication of it and the quantity of it. The thing is that really works well when you have the choice and access. If you're the one purchasing and engaging in it as opposed to it being handed to you, that's a very different thing. So how it's being played in a contextual way really matters in that argument. So I think this is where the context plays a role as well. Something we originally started doing, which we really do the culture, I just never do, I just wanted my own information. We use what we call a constant sum approach. So what I do is I ask in each country, hey, when you use marijuana, in what context are you using it and who are you using it with? But you're forced to do it to 100%. So really think through, every time you use marijuana, are you doing it with a friend, your family member, but in context wise, are you doing it at someone's house, are you doing it at a party or things like that? And that will really dictate what these items are gonna be within marijuana. And particularly, how are you engaging with it? The problem we have also is perception of marijuana versus alcohol. Young adults are finding it to be less harmful. And they believe that they might not have cannabis use disorder or believe that they can still drive and not be as impaired to alcohol and so forth. The really important part, and I think what you're most alluded to, there is a shift. College students, particularly in the US, are shifting more to marijuana than alcohol for what really is the reason, but it is becoming that aspect of it. And so with these strategies that Eric produced, first he had a 39 item version, then he found a 17 item version that was more invariant across gender groups and so forth. And so we've been predominantly using 17 items. But as we talked about with Spain, we had to add certain Spanish kind of things that are really contextual. So for example, in Spain, the legal policy around cannabis is illegal unless you go to a cannabis club, which pretty much anyone can do. So do we need to provide strategies that are in that particular setting because that's where they're most likely going to use, as opposed to something that will work easier here in the United States for the common aspects of where you get your marijuana and so forth. The other thing that I think is harder to do, but it's something we need to think about, potency. And how we understand marijuana and edibles and things like that. In these other countries, they don't have access to edibles. So when we looked at constant sum across countries, by far in the US where they want to use edibles, these other countries don't even think about it. These other countries are either rolling it or maybe a little bit of bowls, but not really. And so it's the US that has the most access to all these things. But the problem with potency, how do we account for that when something like this, beyond just don't use more than intended, or don't you to buy a lower amount than what you're used to, but all these strategies don't take into account that aspect of it. Now, the other thing that I think is a big issue in the field, but I don't know how to solve, who uses PBS? The people who actually are good about it. Hey, am I gonna get intoxicated? I'm gonna be safe about it. Because I'm more likely to use it because I'm more conscientious and more likely to plan out my evening. I don't want to tell them not to do that. But yes, go, actually, if you're already doing these things, like how can we improve the efficacy of it, but not just telling you to use it more and more. And it's really interesting for those people, and I think that's what's happening with that moderation issue. If you know you're gonna get messed up, then you're gonna use some of the strategies to reduce the harm, but not the intoxication and so forth. So when we use it as a total score, that maxing really what the true behaviors, the ones that are best and most salient in predicting that. And so I didn't go into detail, but the one where we did the regression for alcohol PBS, we identified the top 5 items in each country, and there were differences of which strategies they're using. So all that's really important, and this is why I'm really excited by the research we're doing in Spain and Argentina, because it's purely culturally specific to their groups, and we're really identifying what will work best for them.
Yeah, it's interesting because like that was something I kept thinking about in your talk, is that like the people who use these strategies are probably the ones who are engaging in more substance use.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
They're the ones that think about it, and so it's almost like the use is not a mediator, it's almost like the use is what's maybe predicting.
So it's more like PBS use predicts use, and then that predicts the consequences.
Well, it's like use predicts PBS.
Oh, yes,
You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Yeah, no, it's a really important part. I mean, it goes back to my notion about habit. It's okay if you use drugs. Now, what are you doing? How are you using it is what's really important. And if you can do it in a safe way, and that's your habitual place. If I just ask you, hey, how many times in the last 30 days you use every day? Oh my God, they're at risk. They're terrible. They might have cannabis use disorder. And they're like, but if you're doing it safely at your own home, when you're going to bed, you're watching a movie, are you at risk? And so I think that brings up a really good point about
It's
this.
like your sample needs to be, you need to have a sample that are all higher risk.
Correct. Yeah, and there's been other researchers who've done it among my students who had were mandated to
Yeah.
treatment or things like that, and trying to improve it and they're getting better. And the really important part is, unlike things you might learn in clinical intervention, that our goal is always to replicate into the real world. This, let's meet them with what they're already doing, and then just helping them better implement it. I think it's where the nice way is.
Well, we haven't published this yet, but I think a bunch of the PBS researchers know that there's Simpson's paradox.
Yeah.
Where you have like between people who use more PBS also use more alcohol or cannabis. But within, like, on a given day, that you use PBS compared to a day that you don't, you use less.
Yeah, yeah, and that is the problem, and in fact, conceptualization, like, these measures are typically the last month, on average, never to always are using this. It's like, man, we're talking about specific drill strategies that you just like, yeah, I'm sure I do that. But it also matters when the day-to-day are you actually doing it. And I think something that I didn't allude to is context matters with the college culture. At William and Mary, we have something called steer clear, where you can literally call them at any time and they'll pick you up at one house and drive you back to campus. Most places don't have something like that free of charge at least. That makes a whole difference. So students at William and Mary aren't endorsing using, like, I don't know yet, are they saying you're using a designated driver or not? Because for them, that's like, they do very perceive them as a designated driver, that's just a different way of doing it compared to other campuses. So at William and Mary, it's really weird. We're a wet campus. You can be 21 and drink on campus, which is kind of unique for most universities. How do I do that? And then another area that some other researchers are doing, and Angelina was doing it, pre-gaming and things. Can you use PBS while tailgating? Colleges for a long time didn't allow alcohol sales at football games. Now that a lot of them are. Now we're going to talk about reducing harm. And they're already pre-gaming. We already know they're tailgating. Now you're going into it and still doing it. People are like, oh, but they're not 21. I'm like, okay, you've obviously never had to. There are ways to do it. So there's newer context, I think, that will play a big role in that as well.